My name is Delamie Prout. I am 37 years old. And the week I said no to my family, my cousin Beau told the entire congregation at First Baptist that I had a stone where my heart used to be. He said it on a Sunday. I heard about it by Wednesday because that is how Harlan County, Kentucky works. You don't need a newspaper. You just need 3 women in a beauty shop and a parking lot that faces the right direction. I was not at the church that Sunday. I was 4 miles up the road, sitting in my truck outside Minnie's Diner on Route 25, eating a biscuit by myself before my shift started, which is exactly where I would rather have been. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories. This is where we share real-life inspired tales of family conflict, betrayal, and the quiet strength it takes to stand your ground. If these stories speak to you, drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. I want to tell you about the summer my grandmother Pearl got sick, what happened with the house on Cutter Ridge Road, and what I found out at my Uncle Virgil's funeral that changed everything I thought I understood about my own family. But I have to go back a little further than that to make it make sense. I have to go back to the summer I was 8 years old, sitting on my grandmother Pearl's back porch, watching her snap green beans into a bowl the color of old cream. My grandmother Pearl Prout lived in a farmhouse on Cutter Ridge Road just outside of Bledsoe, Kentucky, about 12 miles from the Virginia state line. The house was white clapboard with a green tin roof that pinged in the rain, and she had a vegetable garden behind it that she tended herself until she was 79 years old. She grew Roma tomatoes and half-runner beans and a yellow squash that nobody else in the county could get to come in right. She had a fig tree on the south side of the house that she planted in 1968, which my Aunt Loretta always called a waste of water, and a row of irises along the fence that bloomed purple every April without fail. The house had 3 bedrooms, a sitting room, a kitchen with a linoleum floor in a pattern of small brown diamonds, and a back porch that ran the full width of the house. There was a root cellar under the back steps. There was a barn that hadn't been used as a barn since the 1980s, but that still held the smell of hay and old rope and something sweet I could never quite name. Pearl's husband. My grandfather Harlan Prout had died in 1991 when I was 5. I don't remember him well. I remember the shape of his hands and a hat on a peg by the back door and the way my grandmother said his name sometimes in the middle of completely ordinary sentences, like he had just stepped out and would be back directly. I grew up 3 miles away from that house. My mother, whose name was June, was Pearl's youngest daughter. Pearl had 4 children total, my mother June, my Aunt Loretta, my Aunt Bev, and my Uncle Virgil, who was the oldest and the only boy and who everybody treated like the last piece of good china even when he did not deserve it. My mother died when I was 22, a Tuesday afternoon in March, a blood clot that nobody saw coming. After that, I was at my grandmother's house more than ever. I think we were keeping each other company in the particular way that people do when they have both lost the same person. I work at the community health clinic on Pine Mountain Road. I am a licensed practical nurse. I have been there for 11 years. I work 3 12-hour shifts a week. I own a 4-room house on Beach Fork that I bought in 2014 for $87,000. I drive a blue Ford F-150 that I bought used, and I am fine. I have always been fine. The word my family uses is stubborn. The word I use is fine. My Aunt Loretta is the one who manages things. She always has been. She is 7 years older than my mother would have been, and she has run every family gathering since before I can remember, planning the menu at Thanksgiving, setting the date for the Christmas Eve potluck, deciding who sits where, who brings what, how long things go on. She lives in Harlan, about 9 miles from Bledsoe, in a brick ranch house that she keeps so clean it smells like pine sol even in the guest bathroom. She volunteers at the library on Tuesdays. She is on the board of the County Historical Society. Everyone in Harlan County thinks Loretta Prout Combs is a salt-of-the-earth woman who would do anything for her family. She would do quite a lot for her family, that part is true. I want to say something before I go further because I do not want to get ahead of myself. I did not see what Loretta was doing for a long time. I want to be honest about that. I was not watching carefully. I was working my shifts and tending my own yard and driving out to Pearl's on my days off to sit on that back porch and eat tomatoes with salt like we had always done. I thought I understood the shape of my family. I thought Loretta was bossy and controlling and exhausting to be around, and I had decided a long time ago that the best way to handle her was to nod and say yes ma'am and then do exactly what I was going to do anyway. That was my strategy. It kept the peace well enough for a long time. The first time I noticed something was wrong, it was not dramatic. It was a Sunday dinner in August, 2 summers ago at Loretta's house. We had it there once a month, the full family, which meant Loretta and her husband Carl, my Aunt Bev and her husband Donnie, my cousin Beau and his wife Shelby, my cousin Trina and her 3 kids, and me. Pearl was there too, which was the whole point of it, supposedly. we gathered around Pearl. Pearl was 87 by then. She was slower than she had been, and she had some arthritis in her hands that made the bean snapping harder, and she had lost a little weight the previous winter, but she was still herself. She still had opinions about the weather and the garden and the state of Route 25. She still made her chess pie for special occasions. That August Sunday, she sat at the head of the table, which was her spot, and Loretta kept cutting her food for her. That was the thing I noticed. Pearl had not asked her to. Pearl was perfectly capable of cutting her own pork chop. I watched Pearl pick up her knife, and I watched Loretta reach across and take it from her with a smile, saying, "Now, Mama, let me do that," and Pearl let her. But her jaw went tight in a way I recognized because it was the same jaw she made when she was being patient with someone she did not want to be patient with. I looked at Bev across the table, and Bev was looking at her plate. I did not say anything. Pearl did not say anything. Loretta served herself more cornbread. That is not a crime. Cutting someone's meat is not a crime. I know that. I also know that I drove home that night with something sitting in the middle of my chest that I could not quite locate. 2 weeks after that dinner, Pearl called me on a Thursday evening. I was on my couch and I had just gone off a 12-hour shift and I was still in my scrubs because I had not made it as far as changing yet. She called on her landline, which she still had, and her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. She said, "Delamie, I need you to come by. When you get a chance." I said, "I can come Saturday morning." She said, "Saturday morning is fine." I asked if everything was all right, and she said, "I believe so," and the way she said it made the thing in my chest move from the middle to somewhere lower. I drove out Saturday morning with a coffee from Minnie's and a bag of the sour apple candies she liked that they only sold at the Rite Aid in Harlan. It was late August, still hot, and the irises along her fence had gone green and leggy the way they do by the end of summer, and the fig tree had figs on it that were just starting to split. Pearl was in the kitchen. She was wearing her house dress, the blue one with the small white flowers, and she had coffee already made in the percolator and 2 cups on the counter. We sat at the kitchen table, the one with the chrome legs and the yellow formica top, and she wrapped both hands around her cup. She said, "I want to talk to you about the house." I said, "All right." She said Loretta came by last week and she brought a man with her. She said he was a financial advisor. She said he had some papers she wanted me to look at. I said, "What kind of papers?" Pearl said she said it was something about a trust. She said if I put the house in a family trust, it would save on taxes when I go and the family wouldn't have to go through probate. She said it was the practical thing to do. I asked Pearl what she had thought of it. Pearl was quiet for a moment. She turned her coffee cup a quarter turn to the right, which was what she did when she was choosing her words carefully. She said, "I told her I needed to think about it." She did not look happy about that. I asked if Pearl had signed anything. She said no. She said the man had left papers, but she had not signed them. I said, "Grandma Pearl, don't sign anything until I have someone look at it." She said, "That is exactly what I wanted to hear you say." I picked up my coffee and took a sip and looked out the window at the fig tree and the barn and the long flat light of a Saturday morning in late August. She said, "I want the house to go to you when I go, Delamie. You are the one who has been here. I know your mother would have wanted that. I wanted you to know that before anything else happens." I said, "I know, Grandma Pearl, and we don't need to talk about anything going anywhere yet." She said, "I'm 87 years old. We need to talk about it whether it's comfortable or not." So we talked about it. What Pearl told me that morning was this. The house on Cutter Ridge Road had been in my grandfather's family since 1934. It sat on 14 acres, which included the house lot, the old pasture, a woodlot up the back ridge, and a strip of creek bottom along Cutter Branch. My grandfather Harlan had paid off the mortgage in 1978. The house had no liens, no debts attached to it, nothing. It was Pearl's, free and clear. Pearl had a will. She had made it in 2003 when my mother was still alive. In that will, the house went to my mother June. When my mother died in 2009, Pearl had updated the will and the house was left to me. That will had been drawn up by a lawyer named Boyd Tremble in Harlan, who had been doing Prout family legal work since 1985 and who Pearl trusted absolutely. She said, "Boyd has a copy and I have a copy in the root cellar in the blue tin box." I knew that box. I had seen it down there since I was a girl. It had a latch that was stiff, and Pearl kept it up on the highest shelf in the root cellar because she was particular about what stayed dry. I said, "Does Loretta know about Boyd's copy?" Pearl said Loretta knows I have a will, she does not know the particulars. I asked if Loretta had mentioned the trust thing before. Pearl said no, she said this was the first time. She said the man who came with Loretta had a name that Pearl did not catch clearly and a nice suit, and he had spread papers across her kitchen table without asking if he could, and he had used words like estate planning and tax exposure and family security, and Pearl had felt, she said, the way she felt once when a man came to the door trying to sell her a whole house water filter system. Like something was being done at her and she was supposed to be grateful for it. I asked Pearl if I could take the papers with me. She went to the sitting room and came back with a manila envelope that she set on the table between us. I opened it and looked at the first page. It was a document with the words Revocable Living Trust Agreement across the top and a firm name I did not know in Louisville, Kentucky. I did not read the whole thing at the kitchen table. I folded it and put it back in the envelope and put the envelope in my bag. I told Pearl I would have someone look at it. She said, I trust you, Delamere, you know that. I drove home and called Boyd Tremble's office from my driveway and left a message. He called me back that Monday. I drove to Harlan on my next day off and sat across from Boyd in his office above the hardware store and watched him read through the trust documents. Boyd Tremble was 63 years old and had the kind of face that made you feel like things were going to be handled. He read slowly and he did not say anything until he was done. Then he set the papers on his desk and folded his hands. He said this document, if signed, would dissolve Pearl's current will and replace it with a trust arrangement. He said the trustee listed, meaning the person who would control the trust, was not Pearl, it was Loretta. He said this is not a neutral document, this is a transfer of control. I sat in that chair and something went cold somewhere behind my eyes. Not anger yet, more like a door opening onto a room I had not known was there. I asked Boyd what Pearl's options were. He said Pearl's options were entirely her own. He said the will was valid and current. He said Pearl was under no obligation to sign anything she did not want to sign. He said if anyone was pressuring an elderly person to sign estate documents, that was a matter worth taking seriously. I said, how seriously? He said, seriously enough to put it in writing if it continues. I drove back to Bledsoe and I went to my house and I sat in my kitchen for a long time. The autumn came through the window above the sink, the smell of it, dry leaves and cooling earth, and I sat there with Boyd's business card on the table in front of me, and I thought about my grandmother in her blue house dress turning her coffee cup a quarter turn to the right. That night I called Pearl and I told her what Boyd had said. I told her not to sign anything and not to let anyone bring documents to the house without calling me first. She said she understood. She said, I raised 4 children and I know when I'm being managed. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't imagining it. I said you were not imagining it. I did not call Loretta, I did not say a word to Bev or Bo or Trina, I just went back to work and waited. The next family dinner was in September at Bev's house this time because it rotated, and I went because I always went and because I wanted to watch. I am good at watching. I have always been good at watching. When you work in a clinic, you learn to notice the things that people are not telling you, the way they hold their arm, the way they blink too slowly, the particular quality of a pause that means something has been left out. I brought that same attention to Bev's kitchen table. Loretta was warm with me that night, which I noticed. She said, Delamere, you look tired. Are you working too many shifts? She said it the way you say something when you are trying to read whether someone knows something. I said I was fine and watched her eyes. Pearl was quieter than usual. She ate her beans and her chicken and she had a small piece of coconut cake, and when Loretta reached over to refill her sweet tea without asking, Pearl put her hand over her glass first. Just her hand, flat over the glass, so Loretta had to stop. Loretta smiled and pulled the pitcher back and said, Oh, Mama, you always had your own mind, and laughed, and Pearl looked out the window at Bev's backyard. I drove home that night with the cold thing still behind my eyes. In October, Pearl had a fall. She did not break anything, but she bruised her hip and she was shaken, and the doctor at the emergency clinic said she needed to be careful and maybe think about some assistance at home. I went to the ER that night. I sat with her while they checked her over. I drove her home and made sure the throw rug by the back door was moved and the bathroom had a grip bar and the back porch light was working. Loretta arrived the following morning. I was still there, still in the kitchen making oatmeal when Loretta came through the door with Bo. I had not known they were coming. Loretta had not called me. She came in and looked at me and then looked at Pearl and said, Now, Mama, this has gone on long enough. We've been talking and we all agree it's time for you to come stay with me and Carl. I have the room and it only makes sense. Pearl was at the kitchen table. She had her coffee. She put both hands around the cup and she looked at her oldest daughter and she said, "I'm not going anywhere, Loretta." Loretta said, "Now, Mama, you fell and you could have broken your hip, and what if Delamie hadn't been there?" Pearl said, "Delamie is here quite often as it happens." Loretta said, "That is not a permanent arrangement." She looked at me when she said it. She looked at me for just a second, and the look said something that her mouth was not saying, something about whose arrangement I was. Beau was standing by the back door with his hat in his hands, and he was looking at the floor, which was what Beau did when he knew something was happening that he did not want to be the one to speak to. I said, "Pearl knows her own mind." Loretta said, "I am not asking for opinions here, Delamie. This is a family matter." I said, "I am family." The kitchen was quiet. The percolator made a small sound. Loretta adjusted the dish towel on the oven handle, straightened it, smoothed it, even though it had not been crooked. Pearl watched her do it. I watched Pearl watch her. Pearl said, "I will let you know if anything changes, Loretta. Thank you for coming." Loretta left. Beau left behind her, not making eye contact. I stayed and finished the oatmeal. After they were gone, Pearl said to me, "She wants the house, Delamie." I said, "I know, Grandma Pearl." She said she has always wanted the house. Since before your grandfather was cold, she wanted the house. I know my own children. I said, "Nothing is going to happen to the house." She said, "I know that too. I just needed to say it out loud to someone." In November, I said no for the first time in a way that everyone heard. Loretta had organized a family meeting. She called it that, a family meeting, which should tell you something about Loretta, that she calls things by their correct bureaucratic names so they sound official and inevitable. She sent a group text to everyone, including me, saying there was going to be a family meeting at her house on a Sunday afternoon in November to discuss Mama's care and living situation going forward. I drove to Loretta's that Sunday with my coffee from Minnie's, and I sat in her living room on her floral sofa with Carl and Bev and Donnie and Beau and Shelby and Trina, and we all looked at each other, and Loretta stood at the front of the room like she was addressing a county commission meeting. She had a printed agenda. She had printed out an agenda on paper and she passed it around. That is the kind of woman Loretta is. The agenda said Item 1, Pearl's fall and current mobility concerns. Item 2, home care options. Item 3, long-term living arrangement. Item 4, estate planning to ensure the family home is protected. I looked at Item 4 and I felt the thing behind my eyes go from cold to something else. Not hot, just very, very still. Loretta talked for a while about Pearl's fall and the bruised hip, and the needs of elderly people and the importance of family support, and everyone nodded. And then she got to Item 3, and she said that the family consensus was that it would be best for Pearl to come live with her and Carl, and she had already spoken to Pearl about it. I said, "When did you speak to Pearl about it?" Loretta said, "I spoke to her last week." I said, "What did Pearl say?" Loretta said, "Pearl has some resistance to the idea, which is completely understandable, but we as a family need to think about what is best for her." I said, "Pearl told you no." Loretta looked at me. She said, "Delamie, Pearl is 87 years old and she had a fall and she is not always in a position to know what is best." Something in me went very flat and very calm, the way things do when I am in a room at the clinic and something is going wrong and I need to be the most useful person there. I said Pearl is fully competent and she said no, and that is her answer. Loretta said, "I don't think you understand the full situation." I said, "I think I do." There was a silence in that living room. Carl was looking at the wall, Bev was looking at her hands. Beau was looking at the floor again, which was becoming his characteristic expression at family events. Loretta said, "We haven't gotten to Item 4 yet." I said, "I know what Item 4 is." She said, "Do you?" I said, "Boyd Trimble already looked at that document. The answer is no." The silence after that was a different kind, the kind that has shape and weight to it. Loretta said, "Boyd Trimble works for Pearl, not for you." I said, "That's right, he does," and Pearl said no. Loretta said, "I have only ever tried to look out for this family." I said, "I know you believe that." I put my agenda paper on the coffee table and I picked up my coffee and I drank the rest of it and I set the cup on her coaster and I said, "I have to work tonight. I need to get home and sleep." And I stood up and I put on my coat and I left. I drove home on Route 25 with the heater going and the early dark of November pressing in from all sides and something in my chest that was too complicated to name. I was not happy about any of it. I was not triumphant. I had not won anything yet. I had just said no in a room, and now everyone in Harlan County was going to hear about it, and I knew exactly how long it would take. 3 days, as it turned out. By Wednesday, I had gotten texts from Trina saying I had upset Loretta terribly and she was only trying to help Mama. I had gotten a voicemail from Beau that used the word heartless, though he was gentler about it than he would be on Sunday in front of the congregation, still finding his footing with it. I had gotten a call from Bev who said she didn't want to get in the middle of it, but couldn't I see how hard this was on Loretta? I said to Bev, Loretta is not the one I am worried about. Bev was quiet and then she said, I know Pearl is stubborn, but she could get hurt. I said I am out there twice a week, and I have arranged for the home health aide from the clinic to check in on Thursdays. Bev said Loretta doesn't know about that. I said no, she doesn't. And then Bev said something I have thought about since. She said, Delamie, you know Loretta always expected to get the house. You know she always thought it would be hers. I said that has nothing to do with anything. Bev said, I know that, I'm just telling you how she sees it. I drove out to Pearl's that Thursday with the home health aide, a woman named Sandra who was 54 and had been doing home care for 20 years, and who Pearl took to immediately, possibly because Sandra brought her a word search book and did not try to cut her pork chop. Pearl was in good spirits. She had been in the garden that morning, just walking through it even though it was November and there was nothing left but the dried stalks of the tomatoes and the bare earth. She said she liked to see it in the winter too. She liked to see what it looked like when everything was stripped back. We sat on the back porch even though it was cold. Pearl had her good coat on, the gray wool one she had owned since the 80s, and she had a cup of tea and I had coffee, and Sandra was inside washing the breakfast dishes, which Pearl had also decided was acceptable. Pearl said, I heard about Sunday. I said, word travels. She said Beau is not a bad boy, he just does what Loretta tells him to. I said, I know that. She said she's going to keep pushing Delamie, you know that. I said, I know that too. She said, I need to tell you something I should have told you a long time ago. She set down her tea and she looked out at the bare garden and the barn and the woodlot on the ridge going brown and gray in the late afternoon. She said, when your grandfather was dying the last year of his life, Loretta came to him twice with papers. She said it was for tax purposes, she said it was estate planning, she said all. The same things she's saying to me now, and he signed something. He didn't tell me until after, and by the time he told me he was too sick to do much about it. I felt my chest tighten. I said, what did he sign? Pearl said Boyd Trimble untangled it eventually. It took 2 years and cost us $3,200 in legal fees, and some of that money is still your grandfather's money in my opinion. But Boyd got it sorted. The house stayed in my name where it belonged. I looked at her profile against the November sky. I said, why didn't you tell me this before? She said because I wanted to believe it was in the past, and because I thought maybe Loretta had learned something from it. She paused. She said she has not learned something from it. I drove home that evening thinking about my grandfather in his last year. I thought about documents spread across a kitchen table. I thought about the word heartless sitting in a voicemail and echoing through a church. I thought about Loretta straightening the dish towel on the oven handle. I started keeping notes that week. It is what I do when something at work is unclear and I need to see the shape of it. I started writing down dates and conversations and what was said. I wrote down the date of Pearl's fall, the date Loretta brought the trust documents, the date of the family meeting, what was said at the family meeting. I wrote it in a small green notebook that I kept in my jacket pocket. The winter came in hard in December and Pearl stayed close to the house and Sandra came on Thursdays and I came on Saturdays and sometimes Wednesdays too if I was off. The family dinners continued. I went to the one at Trina's in December and ate my food and listened and watched. Loretta was pleasant to me in the specific way of someone who has decided to wait you out. In January, Pearl got sick. Not seriously, a respiratory thing, but she was in bed for a week and Loretta was there every day, which I understood and which was also, I will say, something I watched. I came on my days off and Sandra came on her regular days and we overlapped with Loretta twice, and both times Loretta was civil to me in the way of a woman who is being civil for an audience. On the second occasion, a Thursday, Loretta said to me in the hallway outside Pearl's bedroom, in a voice low enough that Pearl couldn't hear, I know what you're doing. I said I'm nursing my grandmother through a chest cold. Loretta said, you think you're protecting her. I said I think I'm making sure she has what she needs. Loretta said she needs her family. I said she has me. Loretta said, you are not the family I means. I looked at her in the hallway for a moment. She was holding a glass of water. She had Pearl's good wool blanket over her arm that she had brought from the bedroom for some reason and not brought back yet. I thought in the silence of that moment about what it means to be held and what it means to be held onto. Those are different things. They look the same from the outside, and they are different in a way that matters enormously. I did not say that. I said, I'll sit with her for a while, and I went into Pearl's room and pulled the chair up to the bed, and Pearl opened her eyes and looked at me and said, is she gone? I said she's in the hallway. Pearl said she took my blanket. I got up and opened the door and took the blanket from Loretta's arm without a word and brought it back and spread it over Pearl. Loretta did not follow me in. I want to tell you now about Uncle Virgil, because that is the part that connects the things I have been telling you to the thing I did not know yet. Virgil Prout was Pearl's oldest child. He was 68 years old and he had lived his whole life within 20 miles of where he was born, and he had worked at the Black Mountain Mine for 22 years and then at the County Road Department for another 12, and he was retired, and he and his wife Wanda lived in Baxter in a double wide on a lot he owned outright. He was not a complicated man. He liked cars and he watched the Weather Channel and he made his own sorghum and he called Pearl every Sunday evening without fail. Virgil had a heart attack in February. He was in the ICU at Harlan ARH for 6 days, and then he came home and he was supposed to be careful, and he was mostly, and then in April he had a second one, and that was the end of it. He died on a Tuesday morning. I was not on shift. Wanda called me and I drove over to Baxter and sat with her and the kids for a while, and then I drove to Pearl's and sat with her. Pearl did not cry when I told her. She sat in her kitchen with her hands flat on the yellow table and she looked out the window for a long time, and then she said, he called me Sunday, and that was all she said about it. The funeral was on a Friday at Baxter Baptist, and the whole county came, or it felt like it. Virgil had been known by a lot of people. The parking lot was full and there were trucks parked along the road in both directions. I sat in the second row with the family, behind Wanda and her children. Pearl was on my left and Bev was on my right. Loretta was on Pearl's other side, and Carl and Beau and the whole extended family filled the row and the row behind us. The service was what those services are. There was music and scripture and a man from the road department who told a story about Virgil that made people laugh in the soft, tired way of people who needed to laugh. There was a woman from the church choir who sang something I can't name, but that I will hear for the rest of my life, probably in that particular key. After, at the cemetery, I stood by Pearl and held her arm, not because she needed it but because I wanted to, and the April wind came across the ridge, and the dogwoods were just starting to come out along the tree line, white and fragile in the gray afternoon. Wanda found me at the reception, which was at the church fellowship hall, the tables covered in the food that Harlan County women bring when someone dies, casseroles and ham and potato salad and deviled eggs and 3 kinds of pie. Wanda was a small woman with her husband's same calm, and she had been crying, but she was steady now, and she took my arm and steered me to the hallway outside the kitchen. She said, Della me, I need to tell you something Virgil wanted you to know. I said, all right. She said he wanted to tell you himself, but he kept putting it off, and then she paused and shook her head. She said he told me that about 12 years ago, Loretta came to him with a proposal. She had a man from a real estate office in Harlan, and she wanted Virgil to sign something that said he had no interest in or claim to the family property on Cutter Ridge Road. She said it was to simplify the estate when the time came. She said it was just paperwork. I said, did he sign it? Wanda said he signed it. She said he told me later that he wasn't sure he should have, but Loretta told him it was just a formality and Pearl already knew about it, and he trusted Loretta and he signed it. I said, did Pearl know? Wanda said Pearl did not know. Virgil figured that out within about 6 months, and by then it was too late. I was standing in the hallway of Baxter Baptist with the smell of ham and coffee coming through the door, and the sound of people talking in low voices, and the thing behind my eyes had gone from still to something I still don't quite have a word for. It was like every small wrong thing I had cataloged over years suddenly had a frame around it. I said, do you have a copy of what he signed? She said, that is the other thing. She reached into her pocketbook and took out a folded envelope and held it out to me. She said Virgil kept a copy. He said he was going to show it to a lawyer eventually, he just never got around to it. I took the envelope, I put it in the inside pocket of my coat against my chest. I said, Wanda, thank you. She said, Virgil thought you should know. He should have told you himself, but she stopped. She said he was ashamed. That's the honest truth. He signed something he shouldn't have, and it took him 12 years to admit that. I went back into the fellowship hall and I got a cup of coffee and I stood by the wall and I watched my family move through the room. I watched Loretta embrace Wanda. I watched her talk to the pastor. I watched her touch Pearl's elbow and say something in her ear and watched Pearl's jaw do the thing it did. I watched Beau by the dessert table eating chess pie, not looking at anyone in particular. I watched Bev talking to someone from the Historical Society. I watched Carl looking at his phone. Tell me, have you ever been in a room with someone who has done you harm? Not a dramatic harm, not violence, but the slow, quiet kind, the kind that takes years to accomplish, and you are looking at them across a fellowship hall eating pie and listening to them receive condolences for the death of the person they spent 12 years quietly maneuvering against, and you have the evidence of it in your coat pocket? Have you ever been that person? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time, because what happens next is the part I've been building toward this whole time. I drove home from Virgil's funeral with the envelope in my coat pocket. I did not open it until I was at my own kitchen table with the lights on, and the evening coming down outside and a glass of water in front of me because I did not think I needed coffee for this. Inside the envelope was a single folded document, 3 pages, handwritten in places and typed in others, notarized at the bottom by a notary whose stamp said Harlan County, Kentucky, dated November 14, 2012. It said that Virgil Dean Pruitt, in recognition of his share of the family estate, had received compensation in the amount of $8,000 from Loretta Combs and was signing away any future claim to the real property known as the Pruitt Farm on Cutter Ridge Road, Letcher County. She had paid him $8,000. In 2012, that property was worth considerably more than $8,000. It was worth that on the low end then, and it was worth more now. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. Then I called Boyd Tremble and left a message, even though it was a Friday evening after a funeral, because I needed to say the words out loud to someone even if it was just his voicemail. I said, Boyd, I have a document you need to see. It concerns the Pruitt property on Cutter Ridge Road and something that happened in 2012. Please call me when you can. He called me back the next morning. I drove to Harlan on Monday and sat in Boyd's office again and watched him read the document. He read it twice. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "This is interesting." I said, "Is it valid?" He said, "It has some problems." He said Virgil was signing away something that was not yet his to sign away, as Pearl was still living and the property had not been transferred. He said the circumstances of how it was obtained, the payment of $8,000, which was significantly below any fair valuation, were worth examining. He said the fact that Pearl was not informed was worth examining. He said if Loretta attempted to use this document as part of any future estate action, it would be challenged. He said, to put it plainly, she would lose. I asked Boyd what we should do. He said, for now, nothing. Pearl is alive and her will is current and no court action has been initiated. He said, what I would suggest is that Pearl be aware of this document and that we document its existence. He said I should keep it somewhere secure. I said, it's in my coat pocket. He said a safe deposit box might serve better. He paused. He said, Delamy, I want you to know that I drew up Pearl's will and I know its contents and I have been watching this situation for some time. Pearl is well protected. Her will is solid. I am not worried about the legal outcome here. I said, I know that. I just want to make sure Pearl knows too. He said, I think Pearl has always known more than she's let on. I drove to Cutter Ridge Road that afternoon. It was a Monday in April and Pearl's irises were up along the fence, purple and open, the same color they had always been, the same color they were the first spring I could remember. Pearl was on the back porch with her tea, not in her coat this time because the afternoon was warm enough, and she looked up when she heard my truck. I sat down in the chair across from her and I took the envelope out of my pocket and I set it on the small table between us, next to her tea. She looked at it, she did not touch it yet. She said, what is this? I said Wanda gave it to me at the funeral. Virgil kept a copy. She picked it up and opened it slowly. Her hands were stiff with the arthritis, but she managed the pages carefully. She read it the way she did everything, without hurry, with her whole attention. When she was done, she folded it back the same way it had been folded and put it back in the envelope and set it on the table. She said 2012. I said yes. She said he never told me. I said Wanda says he was ashamed. Pearl was quiet for a long time. The afternoon moved around us, warm and still, the irises along the fence in the sun, the fig tree budding at the corner of the house. A mockingbird started up somewhere in the woodlot on the ridge. She said $8,000. She said it quietly, not with outrage, with a kind of exhausted precision, like a woman confirming a number she already more or less knew. I said Boyd says it won't hold up if she ever tries to use it. Pearl said Loretta always thought I didn't see what she was doing. I have seen what she was doing for 40 years. I just believed she would stop. I said, do you want me to say something to her? Pearl said no. She picked up her tea. She said, I want you to not say a word to her. I want you to let her believe she has managed everything just fine, and when I go, Boyd will handle it and she will find out then. I said, Grandma Pearl. She looked at me. She said, I am 87 years old and I have earned the right to handle my own family in my own way. You said no to what needed to be said no to. Now let me do what I need to do. I said, yes, ma'am. She said, hand me that envelope. I want to put it with Boyd's copy. I handed it to her and she stood up slowly with her cane and she went inside. I heard the back door open and the sound of her steps on the wooden stairs that went down to the root cellar. A few minutes later, she came back out without the envelope, and she sat down and picked up her tea like nothing in particular had happened. The summer came in and Pearl was all right. She was slower and she had the arthritis, and the doctor had adjusted some of her medications, but she was herself, absolutely herself, out in the garden in the mornings while it was still cool, checking on the tomatoes and the fig tree and the irises that had gone green now, seed heads forming where the flowers had been. I still went to the family dinners. I still sat at the table and ate the food and watched Loretta manage things. The family still thought of me as the one who had caused trouble at the November meeting. Bo was friendly enough to my face, and I understood this was the best I was going to get from Bo. Trina had thawed somewhat. Bev was the same as she always was with me, careful and warm and trying very hard to believe nothing was actually wrong. Loretta was the same as she always was too, smooth and capable and pleasant in the specific way of someone who has decided to play the long game. She brought Pearl her favorite candy from the Rite Aid. She called her every Sunday, the same night Virgil always had. She organized the family dinners with the same printed agendas. She told people in the county that she didn't know what she would do without her family, meaning she was the center of it, and people nodded because that was the shape of the story as they understood it. I did not tell anyone what I knew. Not Bev, not Trina, not anyone. I had my notes in the green notebook and Boyd had the documents and Pearl had the envelope in the blue tin box in the root cellar. I went to work and I drove Pearl to her appointments when her hip was bothering her, and I sat on her back porch and ate tomatoes with salt in July when they came in, and I watched the figs on the fig tree go from green to deep purple as August moved through. In October, 14 months after the November family meeting where I had said no and been called heartless, Pearl had a stroke. It was a Thursday morning. Sandra called me. I left work and drove out to Cutter Ridge Road, and the ambulance was already there and Pearl was conscious, they told me, but her left side was affected and her speech was slowed. I rode to the hospital with her and I held her right hand in the back of the ambulance and she gripped mine back hard, which I took as information about her intentions. Loretta arrived at the hospital within the hour. She was composed and efficient and talked to the nurses in the way of someone who is accustomed to being the person in charge of a situation. She did not talk to me directly for the first couple of hours. She talked around me to Bev when Bev arrived, to Carl on the phone. Pearl was in the hospital for 8 days. I took 3 days of leave from the clinic and was there every day. Loretta was there every day too. We did not fight. We sat in the same waiting room and drank the same bad coffee and ate from the same vending machines and watched the same nurses come and go, and neither of us said anything that did not need to be said. On the 5th day, Pearl was able to talk more clearly. The stroke had affected her left side and her speech was slowed, but it was there. I was in her room on a Thursday evening, just the two of us, the TV off, the windows showing the parking lot and the hills beyond. Pearl looked at me from the bed and said, in the particular careful way she was speaking now, Della me, get Boyd. I said I already called him. She said, good girl. Boyd came to the hospital the following Monday. He sat with Pearl for an hour. I waited in the hallway. When he came out, he said to me, she's confirmed everything and signed a statement. He said he would be filing it in the county records. He said it may interest you to know that she asked specifically that you be made co-executor of the estate alongside him. I said she doesn't have to do that. He said she knows that. Pearl came home from the hospital 2 weeks after the stroke. She came home to Cutter Ridge Road, to her house, to her green tin roof and her root cellar and her irises and her fig tree. Sandra came Monday, Wednesday, and Friday now instead of just Thursday. I rearranged my schedule and came Tuesday and Saturday. Bev came on Sundays, which I was glad of because Bev was always easier than Loretta, and Pearl liked having Bev on Sundays. Loretta came too. She came Wednesday mornings, overlapping with Sandra, and she brought food and she helped with things, and she was, to Pearl's face, entirely attentive and loving. I watched this and I did not say anything, and Pearl knew I was watching, and that was enough for both of us. In March, 6 months after the stroke, Pearl died at home on a Tuesday morning with Sandra there and me there and Bev there. It was peaceful in the way that not everything is peaceful. She had said goodbye in her own way over many months in small particular ways, and I think she knew, and I think she was ready in the way that some people manage to be ready, which is a thing I have seen at work and that I have never been able to fully explain. I called Loretta. Boyd filed the will with the Letcher County Probate Court on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks after Pearl's death. He had a certified copy for me, and he had the original in his files, and he had the corroborating documents, including the Virgil statement and the trust documents that Pearl had refused to sign. The will was simple. The house and the 14 acres on Cutter Ridge Road were left to me, Delamere Prout. Loretta's lawyer, a man from Pineville, sent Boyd a letter saying that Loretta intended to contest the will on the grounds of undue influence. Boyd responded in writing that the will had been executed in 2009, reviewed by Pearl in 2021, reconfirmed by signed statement in 2023, and that Pearl had demonstrated full legal capacity at each signing. He included a copy of the 2012 document Wanda had given me, the one where Loretta paid Virgil $8,000 to walk away from his interest in the property, along with a note about the circumstances of its execution. We never heard from Loretta's lawyer again. I know what you might expect me to say here, that I felt righteous, that justice was done, that the family acknowledged what had happened and some kind of peace was reached. The truth is messier and quieter than that. Bev called me the week after probate was settled and she said, I'm sorry, Delamere. I said, for what? She said, for not seeing it sooner. I said, Bev, you couldn't have known everything. She said, I could have known more than I did. We did not say much more than that, but I think it mattered to both of us to say that much. Bo sent a text that said, I'm sorry for what I said from the pulpit. I texted back, I know. We have not spoken since, but that is its own kind of resolution. Trina I see sometimes at Minnie's. She is warm enough, she does not bring it up. Loretta I have not spoken to since the hospital. I don't expect to. I am not angry at her in the sharp way anymore. What I am is done, which is different from angry and quieter and more permanent. I want to tell you about one more thing. From that winter, the winter after Pearl's stroke, when she was home and healing and the days were short and the hollow behind the house collected snow and held it longer than the road did. I came out on a Saturday in December and Pearl was in the kitchen at the table with her good reading glasses on and a yellow legal pad in front of her, and she was writing. She was writing slowly, her right hand only, the left still not fully reliable, but she was writing. I made coffee and sat across from her and did not ask what she was doing. After a while she said, I am writing down what happened, all of it, going back to when Virgil signed that paper and before that. I said, do you need help? She said, I can still write a sentence, Delamere. I said, yes, ma'am. She wrote for another 20 minutes, not continuously, with pauses where she looked out the window at the snow, and I drank my coffee and looked at the room. The yellow Formica table, the percolator, the wallpaper she had put up in 1979, a pattern of small blue morning glories, faded now but still present. The hook by the back door where my grandfather's hat had hung until one day it was not there anymore, though the hook remained. When she stopped writing, she put the legal pad face down on the table. She said, I want you to have this when I am gone, not to do anything with necessarily, just to have, so you know I saw it clearly. I said, I already know you saw it clearly. She said, I know you know, but I want it on paper. I am 87 years old and I have earned the right to put things on paper. I said, yes, ma'am. She said, now heat up that soup on the stove. I made it this morning before you got here. I heated the soup, a vegetable beef she had made from a recipe her own mother had given her, and we ate it at the yellow table with crackers, and we talked about the garden and what she was planning to put in come April, the Romas and the half-runners, and whether she wanted to try the yellow squash again in the corner bed by the fence. We talked about the weather and the price of chicken at the Harlan Kroger and the state of Route 25, which had needed repaving for 3 years and was not getting it anytime soon. We did not talk about Loretta, we did not need to, that conversation had been had. What we were doing now was what we had always done, which was sit in the same kitchen and eat food and be in each other's company, and I think we both understood without saying it that we did not know how many more Saturdays there were, and that the right thing to do with a Saturday like that was to eat the soup. The legal pad is on the shelf now, next to the blue tin box. Pearl's handwriting on the yellow paper, slow and deliberate, the letters careful the way they were those last months when her hand was learning itself again. I have not read it all the way through yet. I will, I think, in the spring. When the irises come up and the light is good and I have a Saturday with nothing else in it. I still live in my four-room house on Beach Fork. I still drive my blue Ford. I still work my 3 12-hour shifts at the clinic on Pine Mountain Road. I go out to Cutter Ridge Road on Saturdays. I sit on the back porch in Pearl's chair, the one that is still shaped by her, and I have my coffee and I look at the garden and the barn and the woodlot on the ridge. The fig tree will need pruning this spring. The irises will come up in April, same as they always have. Last Saturday I went down to the root cellar. I have not moved anything yet. I am not ready to move anything. But I went down there and I found the blue tin box on its shelf, latched, same as it has always been, and I carried it up the wooden stairs and I sat at the yellow kitchen table and I opened it. Inside was Pearl's copy of her will, a copy of my grandfather's service record from the Army, a photograph of Pearl and Harlan at their wedding in 1958, 2 letters tied with kitchen string, and at the bottom the envelope Wanda had given me at Virgil's funeral. I held that envelope for a while, it felt lighter than I expected. I put everything back in the box and latched it and took it to the sitting room and put it on the shelf where Pearl kept her good things, the blue china, the small clock, the photo of my mother at 18, and I set the blue tin box right there among them. The next morning I sat on the back porch and it was still cold enough for a coat, but the light was the early March light that is starting to think about spring, and I could see where the irises were just barely breaking ground along the fence, the first green tips of them, the same color they have been every April of my life. That is where it is now, the box on the shelf, the irises in the ground, the coffee getting cold in the cup beside me. The word heartless was meant to hurt, and it did for a while's what I know. Now what I think Grandma Pearl knew all along is that saying no is sometimes the most loving thing in a person's whole quiet repertoire. You do not always get to explain it in the moment. You do not always get the fellowship hall and the approved condolences and the nods that say, yes, you did the right thing. Sometimes you just get a back porch and an early March morning and irises coming up through the cold ground because they always do. Because that is what they know how to do, because nobody ever had to tell them it was the right thing. I think that is enough.